Now, we have 40 minutes for the session, and I would like somebody to tell me when 20 minutes are up. Is that about right? 20 minutes, if I have 20 minutes of questioning, then 20 minutes for all of you. Can I have a volunteer, please? It's hard to volunteer to tell me. Thank you. And your name is? Thank you very much, Nick. Thank you. That's wonderful. So I'm not going to tell you who Amanda is. You all know who she is. I will say, because it's important that you know where I'm coming from, is Mike Tomlinson still here? Mike was also a great chief inspector of schools who was just speaking here. I think Amanda Spielman has that quality of extraordinarily high intelligence, emotional as well as intellectual intelligence, and courage and administrative organizational know-how, not just in terms of the internal organization of Ofsted, but how that rolls out across the country to be a complete game changer for the country's schools at this extraordinarily important moment in our country's history. Arguably, it's always important, but I think there are reasons that might emerge why it's particularly important at the moment. So, 20 minutes, 19 now. Amanda, the purpose of schools, what do you see they're here for? Why, if we got rid of them, would anyone notice? Why are they here?
Well, of course, schools are and always have been here for lots of reasons. And some of the silliest characterizations that you hear sometimes are people saying, well, once upon a time it was all about this and now it's all about that. The reality is that they've also always served a number of purposes, some for individuals, some for society as a whole, some for economic development. So I would pick out perhaps the pursuit of knowledge for the individual in itself, always an easy one to lose sight of. Development of individual skills related to that, developing skills in a workforce, in an economic model, but also a socialization, creating a society is not something that just happens by chance. Ever since national education systems have existed in every country, part of the role that's contemplated is around that formation and sustenance of a nation. And then, of course, there is just the wider advancement of civilization, which, again, is something I don't like losing sight of. Now, what is not, as the inspectorate, though, for me to opine on, is which of those are the most important. The way I view it is that the best thing I can do is to make sure that we have the breadth of perspective to recognise all of them, but also recognise that different politicians and governments put different weightings on those purposes. So while none of them ever disappears entirely, the political focus and prioritisation can shift around, and we have to recognise that.
So it's genuinely difficult for us to understand, and probably it's quite difficult maybe for you also to understand the relationship with the politicians, not just a change of party label, but also a change of education secretary. And this year we could have, well, we're going to have two prime ministers. We may have two education secretaries. We may even have a third prime minister if there is a general election, and maybe a third education secretary. How can you say how much of your work carries on, 90%, or can you not categorize it? And what are the parts that are most susceptible to the personality of the education secretary and to the colour of the party?
Well, at one level, once a spending review has set our budget to a very large extent, we carry on with the programme. We do not have to ask if we can spend our budget this way or that way. There is, so there are several pieces. Sorry, I don't know if I've got this in the right place.
Can you all hear all right, by the way?
Yeah. So the core job of inspecting and regulating and reporting independently on what we do will always be there.
Yes.
And that's one piece that must be kept up, and where we must make sure that we maintain the standards, the integrity, the independence throughout. Around that, we have pieces of work around building frameworks, making sure that we've got the evidence, the justification for what we're doing. And that's something that I've made rather larger than it had been for a few years, because I think it's extraordinarily important that what a tool like inspection bakes into the system, as far as you can possibly make it, is only what can be justified by the state of knowledge about education as far as it goes, or the state of the law.
Sure.
So I'm trying to make sure that we have a sort of disciplined constructive inspection, not just an interesting one, which leads to some fascinating to and fro's when every sort of fashionable idea preoccupation, people immediately say schools must teach, and then in the next breath they say and Ofsted must inspect.
Yeah.
So I spend way more time than I ever expected when I came into this job, explaining to people, one, why even if their thing is very important, schools aren't necessarily the place to embed it. And even if it is something that you'd like schools to do, inspection is not necessarily the right lever by which to make sure it happens. It's really interesting how diverse. I don't have as difficult a position as CQC in some respects.
Just remind people who CQC.
The Care Quality Commission, which inspects many kinds of health provision and adult social care. I will tell you that I felt deeply for CQC inspectors when I read that one of the things that they were putting some emphasis on is making sure that adults in social care enjoy a sort of full and varied personal life. And I did think, how the hell are they going to inspect that?
Well, the mind boggles. So just give us...
Go on. Well, I'm sorry, I'd slightly diverted myself there. But this point about finding... the research piece, there is also a piece about what are the things that are emerging as system concerns, because starting from getting on for 20 years ago, certainly 15 years ago or thereabouts, a decision was taken to shrink inspection radically.
Yep.
So it ceased to be a subject by subject review of what was happening in each school, and became a much briefer, higher level scrutiny. I think it's fair to say something got lost. And I think in the mind of government, perhaps more in government than in the inspectorate, it came to be conceived of as being essentially about arriving at a judgment. Yeah. And I think in some ways, so paradoxically, at a point where actually the burden of inspection was significantly reduced, it came to be perceived as more burdensome because some of the parts that were of most value to schools themselves ceased to happen.
I certainly lost as a history teacher. I valued the detailed comments about history. But can you give us a sense, Amanda, about, I don't know the answer to this question, does every country have a inspection service as important and central as ours? Has it been as central so we had Mike Tomlinson here earlier from 20 years back. Has it always been as important? Our education school here was founded by one of your predecessors, Chris Woodhead. So just give us a sense of that. So you've told us about the funding at the comprehensive spending review and the legislative framework setting us up, but just give us a sense of perspective there.
Paradoxically, we are probably smaller but more influential than the inspectorates that exist in most European countries. Part of that is in your smaller countries, typically there is a national inspectorate, often rather closer to the Department of Education, the National Department of Education, than perhaps we are. Often quite deeply integrated into policy and policy implementation. In larger countries, it's relatively unusual to have a national inspection system. It is more commonly at provincial level or equivalent. So there aren't many that cover anything like as many children. There is a national inspection system in France that sits on top of a regional inspection system, for example. Though, interestingly enough, the national inspection system inspects teachers, not schools, which is a concept that often blows people's minds.
Can you just unpack that a bit? How does that feel different?
Well, it's remarkably intense. It's not something that happens every 3 years throughout. I think you have to have it to get through an early career gateway, and then beyond that, it's something that you can volunteer for to get certain kinds of career acceleration or advancement, but you don't have to do it if you don't want to. So people are doing. I've observed one of these. People are doing it by choice, but it is nevertheless very directly an hour of being observed and an hour of discussion with an inspector, following which you are graded on a 7 or 9 point scale, and that goes with you and determines what advancement, if any, you are allowed. So it is personal in a way that inspection absolutely isn't here. So there are many models. Yeah. The balance, I think you were talking in the previous session, I was only there for the tail end of it. We do have this high autonomy system here, which does necessitate some kind of handle to make sure that autonomy is being used well. The systems that don't have inspection at all, or anything equivalent, typically are systems where there is the most direct top-down control all the way through, as Mike, I think, was saying, to what's happening in every classroom at 10 o'clock. If you have absolutely direct control and line manage every teacher in the country through every head, then the levers of control look a little different from when the head in a school has total control over who they employ, as here.
Does Ofsted desire to help teachers to get better and better? Is that not part of its role, and leadership teams also? And how does that happen?
Well, this comes back to what I was saying about the dangers of accidentally narrowing your concept of what inspection is. And that was very much part of the strategy development process that I took Ofsted through a couple of years ago. And really thinking about what being a force for improvement in the system means. I think, historically been quite good at serving the needs of government. We've been fairly good at serving the needs of parents, that we've got scope to report better in more useful ways. This thinking about what is it, without radically changing the scope of inspection. I suspect if I turned up at the Treasury saying, give me a giant pile of money, I would get told where to go. But what is it within the kinds of envelope we're working in that really sets up the most valuable conversations, the best professional dialogue, the kind of conversation that genuinely helps leaders, and to the extent that we can within this small scope, into at least a selection of individual subjects, can help us get underneath and get people thinking, talking in the right way. I saw this on a pilot inspection for the new framework a few weeks ago in a primary school. The model has inspectors doing one of the core subjects, at least one of the core subjects, but also outside the core, and partly picking subjects that the inspector thinks perhaps needs looking at, but also the ones the school wants to look at. So a mixture and some shared construction here. And we're looking at the history, the primary history here. And my inspector did an absolutely brilliant job of getting. They had the sort of skills matrix that was essentially what they were planning their curriculum off, and showed the inspector where they thought it cross-referenced into the current national curriculum. And the inspector said, okay, so what does that translate into year by year? And pulled out some books and laid out books from each year side by side, and did a brilliant job on helping the teacher responsible. It's primary school, so it's not a head of history, but the teacher responsible for history really look at and think about and see what was strong, but also what wasn't so strong. And they then had a really intelligent, constructive discussion about what the ways forward might be.
There's nothing more rewarding than having those kinds of discussions as a teacher. Many yearn for those.
Well, I think it reprofessionalizes teachers who often complain about feeling disempowered, deprofessionalized, and it also reprofessionalizes inspectors. And
Yep.
having both ends of these kinds of conversation sort of fully engaged is really important. And we've set some constraints around that from our end, because this shouldn't be about every individual wandering off to impose their particular view of what's good in the schools they happen to be sent out to. That would sort of send us back round in a circle. This is why this research foundation for the new framework, and making sure that the conception of curriculum, conception of teaching assessment that are built into that are only what we believe is properly justified. And then we've done a lot of inspector training in that, so that people understand that when they're inspecting, this is the model. The model is the wrong word, but the justified concept that we're working in, that they must not narrow down beyond that to very personal preference. And I think that's very helpful to have that middle point that is neither leaving it completely untouched, because at that point, anybody who comes up with a nice idea, it becomes completely impossible to say, hang on, variations of this have been tried 75 times before and have never worked. So how do you justify doing this to your children now? And you must do it this way, and only one kind of curriculum is ever acceptable. We're trying to find that path along the middle of the ridge in the desert.
Well, it's like, I guess, there's always being a good parent, being a good boss in a company. Is teaching, Amanda, at university different qualitatively to teaching at secondary and primary, or is it a continuum? Because I think, just hands up here, who thinks, even if you don't teach at university, you have just been appointed for the next minute a university teacher, who thinks that teaching at university is qualitatively different? Question one. Question two, who thinks it's pretty much the same, a continuum to teaching at school? Who thinks it's qualitatively a different experience? Hands up. Who thinks it's pretty much the same? And so roughly, what do you think?
I think it's clearly different in aggregate, but I think thinking about the continuum from novice to expert is a really important one. At the individual level, simply in terms of age and stage of development, but also in terms of academic development. When you first encounter at 10, 14, 16, 18, something that is completely new. Some models that say, right, it's university, you're on your own, do risk wasting a lot of people who aren't necessarily quite there for something that says, my only concern is the subject, I will throw out what I can. I'm sorry, this is not saying this is what happens in universities. It's a sort of extreme characterization of things I know about 40, 50 years ago, from which I think the world has helpfully moved on. And at the other extent, treating 18-year-olds like toddlers. And there's also a difference where people are continuing in the study of something they're already some way down, and where they're exposed, it's sort of encountering something that is conceptually completely new or different from what typically happens at school. So I think that understanding of where on those various progressions students are likely to be, and making sure that teaching is pitched to stretching them, as students absolutely should be pushed and stretched, but in a way that makes it likely that they will carry on moving through the course and doing well in it.
I certainly felt the most intellectually exciting time of my life was not writing my doctorate, nor as an undergraduate, but was actually in the sixth form. And as a sixth form teacher earlier in my career, I thought it was about helping them to become independent learners and opening their minds. Let's, and I suppose it depends how we configure it. There's certainly a case, I think, and I say this as truthfully the only person in this country who has run schools and universities. I do think there is a world of opportunity for us to talk more to each other. But I just wanted to just ask a question about the curriculum, and James is beginning to look at me. Am I out of time? Sorry, I got 1 minute. I'm going to tell you then what I haven't had time to ask about, which is about the curriculum and about well-being. And you may want to ask about the curriculum or well-being. That was on my list to ask Amanda. But I want to ask this. So Theresa May is standing down next month, and she is now trying to get through all everything she wanted to do as Prime Minister at the end. How do you have a clear sense in your mind already about how you would like to leave being Chief Inspector, the state of schools, or is that something you're still forming? And do you think you'll get there? Because it is a common experience of most leaders that actually they look back and they feel, woo, they haven't really done everything they wanted to. How are you approaching that as somebody who's thought so much about organisations and about leadership?
I have about 5 pieces that I would really like to accomplish, but the biggest of them was this shift in emphasis in inspection that this new framework represents. I have it published. I have much of the training done. The rest of it happening through the summer. So seeing that through, embedding that, I will be happy with that. I have a number of other pieces that are now working through that I would very much like to accomplish. But explaining, developing, embedding in a way that my successor doesn't get us. So what would you like to do, Chief Inspector? So that there is clarity about the path through which we iterate in the light of decent evidence and experience, that we understand the mechanism by which we carry on developing.
I can see that. So we're going to now move to questions, but a benefit about us all being, we can all certainly use mics, but a benefit about us being much closer is that we can hear each other, so you don't feel you have to have a mic. And I've got a preference for slightly shorter questions. And Jackie O'Hanlon, who is Education Director of the absolutely marvellous Royal Shakespeare Company. Okay, so question there about the place of arts and learning. And Joanne, are you going to come in and...
One thing that's always worried me in a very junior capacity of writing policy recommendations is the potential for perverse consequences to emerge. I was just wondering, Amanda, is this something that you worry about? And are there any policy recommendations that you've made as head of Ofsted that you think have had perverse consequences?
And that's Joanna Williams, formerly of Kent, currently at Policy Exchange. And can I encourage those at the back to come forward? We're very nice down at this centre. We are extremely nice people. The kind of people you would want to sit near. Okay, Amanda.
Okay, on arts and culture, obviously really important part of a well-rounded education. But I do think there is a somewhat misleading narrative here sometimes. If we look using the quite simple mechanism of what qualifications are being taken at 16, the big changes, there's certainly big changes started as early as 2004. The 2 subject groups that seem to have suffered the most over the last 15 years are languages and design and technology, both of which have dropped by 60 to 70%. In that period in terms of take-up at age 16. Both of those I find profoundly concerning. If we look at the arts and also at music and drama, the picture is slightly different in that there's certainly a big reduction in GCSEs, but some of it is a change in who is doing it and what they're taking. If you add in the BTECs, the OCR Nationals, I think there are about as many people doing either a drama GCSE or a BTEC in performing arts or similar as were taking GCSEs 15 years ago. So some of this is a shift where it's different children and perhaps in a different part of the ability range. And we haven't really unpacked that very clearly on who is doing what. Also, and most of the big shift actually came about following the introduction of equivalence into performance tables long before the EBAC came along. So there is certainly a very strong response in the system to policy levers. But I think it's important to recognise that, firstly, it's a number of different policy levers that have had a bearing here, not just one. And the other is that sometimes I think the policy levers that get most embedded are the ones that, for whatever reason, fit most comfortably with what people actually want to be doing anyway. And the ones that get resisted, that don't act, don't have any effect, are ones that they're quite keen that they shouldn't affect. So on languages, for example, I think it's fascinating that the second they were made non-compulsory at Key Stage 4, the study of languages post-14 and language GCSEs started to plummet. Putting languages into the EBAC has barely pushed them back up at all. I think Spanish is up. So we have to be careful to avoid a simplistic narrative, and in my view, talk about and make sure that there is the proper conversation about what is the education that children should be having, and make schools take some responsibility. It's quite unusual, actually, to give schools as much freedom about what subjects they teach and don't teach, and the way they structure options choices from the age of 14 onwards, to make it as easy as we do for children to give things up. Okay. And to push the start of Key Stage 4 back to age 13. So I am really pushing on how do you justify making it possible for children to give things up so early? How do you justify narrowing choices in a way that makes it unlikely they will do these things?
So Joanna's question we're going to come to. Can you just give the mic back to Jackie? Because Jackie is possibly the most influential education director of an arts organisation in the country. And just to respond there, I mean, I feel that you're both on the same side. I mean, I declare an interest. I am on the board of the Royal Shakespeare Company, but go ahead.
I think the final point you were making is a really important one, that what we're seeing is the binary choices that students are having to make between sciences and arts at GCSE, when actually you want to have, I meet so many adult scientists or business people who've actually had the arts as all, a part of their educational lives. And I think that's absolutely the thing that we need to look into. How can we enable GCSE options for students to not force them into making choices that don't...
There's absolutely no need for them to. That's a school decision.
And
Jackie,
what question, I think a final point might be, what question gets asked then to help us assess where are schools, where are the narrowing of choices happening, what's the drivers for that, and where are the examples of schools where that narrowing isn't happening? And
just to finish very quickly, that's the kind of conversation I'm putting back into inspection that hasn't been there for 15 years. So I very much think it needs to be had. I better go on to Joanna's question.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's come. Yep.
Joanna, so policy levers and unintended consequences. Damn right I worry about it. It's part of why I do try, and people in this room may tell me I haven't been very good at it, but I genuinely try to stick to my brief and speak only from things where we have at Ofsted decent evidence, either directly from inspection or from the research that draws together those insights to justify what I say. I think it is really dangerous to become someone who has an opinion on everything. And unintended consequences, absolutely. I had a conversation about this actually this morning with somebody completely different. And one of the things I keep in the back of one of my notebooks is a list of the things that in this and previous lives I think I've got right, but also of the things that I've got wrong. I think it's quite useful to look at that and not think that you are infallible, and recognise that even if you get things that are mostly right, some things will backfire. That's part of why we have this big program of pilot inspections that we've been going through, 250 pilots, to iron out some of the things. Partly why we're setting up the kind of evaluation, not just of the sort of technical, in the sort of most technical way, do inspectors go along the right groups at the right moment, but to say, what is the impact it's having? Is it having the intended consequences for people at the receiving end? Is it leading to things it shouldn't? If not, how do we need to iterate and think? We're setting that up from the very beginning to look at that. And it's hard, and we see all across government and public policy that once people have got in there, this is the thing they're going to do. It's very hard to do that. So I think you have to build it in from the start, so that you have no choice but to face your mistakes in due course.
I love that. That's so candid and honest. Joanna, very briefly, if you were Chief Inspector, what would be the first thing that you would do? And I don't believe it if you say you don't know. You always know.
I think that's absolutely in the right direction.
So
I would continue with Amanda's excellent work.
Very good. Well, there you are. You heard it here. Let's have Professor Tooley over there, and then we have Reverend Peter Williams is going to ask a question, I think. Very good.
Actually, I mean, your last answer was really answering the question, but more specifically then, what, if anything, in your role has proved more difficult than you anticipated?
Okay, and let's hold on that one. And did I catch your eye? Yes, the question about religion, I think, but I'm not certain. The gentleman in the light blue.
Jonathan Sumpton, in his recent Wreath lectures, has pointed out the way we're becoming increasingly a conformist society. How does Ofsted relate to that? Because you have many of the issues that are germane to that.
So Jonathan Sumption in the Wreath lectures, absolutely excellent if you're not following them.
Starting with James. Sorry, James, remind me what your question was. The Wreath lectures, which I've been listening to, have just distracted me.
More difficult than you anticipated in your role?
I was working with government, find conversations with government that shouldn't necessarily be the hardest bit do to always turn out to be surprisingly difficult. But I guess I should have expected that. I think the pieces, and this very much relates to the Sumption point actually, the pieces that relate to the clashes of different rights and freedoms, I think nationally we do have huge tension at the moment where different rights bump into each other, where people whose identities, interests are very much aligned around one particular kind of right find it extraordinarily hard to see and acknowledge the place where those come into genuine tension with other rights, and that we are collectively quite reluctant sometimes to surface and discuss that constructively. And Ofsted is there, like it or not, we are out there inspecting many of these institutions. We have to address this. We cannot give priority to one over another, though we are frequently characterised by whoever it is who feels that they're not getting the sort of full scope that they want as being opposed to them and in favour of another. It's actually not true. We are genuinely trying as best we can not to gold plate, to do exactly the job that we are set to do. But it is tough, no question about it. It's tough and takes more of my time and sort of mental bandwidth than I would have expected before I started.
Thank you for that. And
sorry, I didn't. So the Sumption. The Sumption lectures are fascinating. I've only listened to the first two, but I think he is nailing exactly some of the things that I'm finding most challenging, and such a fascinating argument from a senior judge, essentially saying we've put too much into the domain of law and haven't left enough in the political space where there is that greater flexibility to adjust the weight and balance of policy without baking things in. The later ones are still stacked up on my iPhone to listen to, but I'm finding it gripping.
Would you sooner listen to Jonathan Sumption's Wreath lecture or the latest Killing Eve? You don't have to answer.
Well, I'm afraid I'm assumption. I'm that kind of person, Anthony.
That is a good choice. I think David Hudson, who's head of the Royal Latin, is going to ask a question. Yeah.
I was interested by your point on government.
Yeah.
It seems to me you're taking more of a lead on developing what's actually going on in schools and government are. Do you think that's right?
Well, I think my term in this job has coincided with a particularly tough period for government and for ministers, and with the wider national situation, which inevitably draws every cabinet minister into spending a huge proportion of time into thinking about the collective responsibility of government, and away from their ministerial portfolios. I find it hard to say that's unreasonable or it's unreasonable that has happened. But yes, I have the luxury of being in a role that is remarkably little affected by the whole Brexit conversation. Damn, I was going to trying to get through this without
You
without
did really
that word
well. I'm afraid to
passing my
say
lips.
you're not going to be paid
Yeah.
that £5,000.
There we go.
That was a joke, by the way. Sorry.
But I've been able to concentrate on the job. I was very lucky. I had a kind of apprenticeship through my master's in comparative education, through being co-founder of one of the big academy chains, and taking on some really tough schools and dealing with all the things that came through that. With 5 years as chair of Ofqual, seeing what education measurement can and can't do and how to use it well and how to use it badly. And also understanding the workings of government and where non-ministerial departments sit in this wider government and this what gets things done, what doesn't. So inadvertently, I put together a really good apprenticeship for this job, I think, which meant that when I came in, I think some people who have only done one of those or been in a very different context, I suspect the first 6 or 9 months in this job are absolutely bewildering. I had all that prep, and I had 5 months between my nomination being confirmed and actually starting. So I was able to come in with a lot of clarity actually about what I wanted to do and what I thought it would take to do it. And I've been pleasantly surprised actually by how much it's been possible to build support and consensus. I think the kind of conversation we've had over the last couple of years, airing some of the things that have not been as good as they should be underneath, making some of the difficult stuff discussable in the right way, and getting some consensus about the ways forward has been really valuable for me. Thank you.
It's been really welcomed in schools. Now, I want all of you to imagine fantasy land, that you are in front of the Chief Inspector of Schools in a very select group, able to ask the Chief Inspector any question that you would like to ask. I mean, impossible, hey? But you are now in that position, and the question... Good, they're all coming now. Yeah.
Hi, Michelle Morgan, Bournemouth University. Can I ask a question? How can Ofsted and universities improve the dialogue in helping institutions understand how students learn in schools and colleges? And the reason I say this is that in my transitions work with students, I see more and more the knowledge, the independent learning changing. I was at a school a few weeks ago where the library consisted of 2 trolleys in a corridor. Oof. And, this is down to the cost of books. So many of my academic colleagues who would have grown up with a library, a book, learning how to actually look through it, etc., they assume that that's how students, when they come to university, know how to learn.
Very good question, and a question at the front, belted out, so we won't get the mic round. So John Cash Foundation.
We're able to support, thank you very much, we're able to support schools directly in the primary and secondary sector. We're also involved in the tertiary. But I'm intrigued by your new framework, which talks, delighted to read in it, about enrichment.
Yep.
Where we are in our part of London with our endowment, we can support enrichment. There are schools throughout many parts of England which aren't so well favoured. So how do you cope with the variability, even though it's not sort of high on the shopping list of what you're looking for, in the potential for enrichment of the student experience?
Got that. To coming to you, gentlemen, in a moment, both of you. So 2 questions to begin with. Amanda.
Am I
Yeah, off you go.
answering these now?
Yeah.
Okay, at the back, I hope, and there are 2 bits in there, one of which is around, it reinforces, in my view, this need to make sure that inspection goes back to the substance of education, to the A-level grades or BTEC grades or whatever may look lovely, but what are they actually learning? Are they getting a meaty education that genuinely sets them up for the next step? So that's one piece. In what Ofsted can do to help universities, do you know, that's a question that's never been asked of me before, and I don't have an easy answer, but I do want to go away and really think about it. I suspect it might be in some of what we do in the research and publication side more than anything else, but I genuinely want to take that one to think about.
And I'm just going to take these just very quickly, because we're out of time, but just very quickly,
A
2 sentences.
really quick tongue-in-cheek one. If an outstanding school isn't being inspected but knows it's no longer outstanding, or RI, should it put its hand up and say, please inspect me?
Okay. And then there was a gentleman here. Yep.
Neil Ward, University of East Anglia. Schools work in a very difficult climate, but I wondered if you could comment on education in FE colleges.
Okay, so
and
one
what
on
Ofsted can do to
FE,
help.
and there was a final one. I just wanted, gentlemen here at the front.
This is a memory challenge for me, isn't
and
it?
this is a very difficult challenge to remember 3 questions. Yep.
Amanda, I enormously admire the focus on sort of richer conversations and inspections that is coming as part of the new framework. How do you stop that being a sort of narrower sample of the sort of scope of a school's activity?
Okay.
In the same.
And here's a challenge, Amanda. You have 2 minutes to answer all of those.
All of those. Right. On enrichment, we absolutely recognise that not every school has the same access. One level, we have to look at the pupil experience. Does it add up to something that's good and strong? And people do that remarkably well in different ways, in different contexts. I don't have an anxiety about that. Over here, it'd be fascinating. I'm not sure that any of them ever has. But I think it's quite an easy one to sidestep that one by simply not having the exemption. Here, FE is the place where we are really seeing the impact of the funding struggle, and where I've talked about this. I think good FE is immensely valuable. I think it's very easy for the post-16 conversation to over-focus on universities, not least because pretty much every policymaker everywhere went through university rather than a vocational route. I have put a lot of my time into looking at FE and also looking at the pathways that the lower half of the ability and attainment range go through. In fact, quite a lot of my time in the last few months, because I think this is the place that we find hardest to get right nationally and always have done, so that what can we do and what can we crystallise out of our work that helps get the focus on the right things. And the last piece here on the conversation, in a sense, what we're doing is reassigning time that was spent more on digging down seven layers into the numbers, to saying we shouldn't be sort of duplicating and digging on many different cuts into the data at the expense of the conversation about what the education is. So we have managed to reconfigure the structure of inspections to pull a bit more time into more physical inspector time into most inspections. But it's also it is definitely a rebalancing to spend less time in one kind of conversation and more in another. So net, I think it'll be more time on the right things.
Okay, that's lovely. So we had 9-10 questions there. Many things strike me about you, Amanda. One is your candor, your honesty. When you don't know the answer, you tell us you don't know the answer. You really try to get to the heart of what everybody's concerned about. And for us here at the festival, we're about conversation. We simply believe that by getting people together, we get to a better quality of truth and
Absolutely.
understanding. And that's what we're all about. And finally, there's only one person unhappy here, and this is the dog who's been in the front row, who is so disappointed that you have had this very calming effect. So disappointed it's coming to an end. Oh, they're now showing us their bottom. Thank you, Amanda, very much indeed.
Thank you.